Hello, welcome to the Magnifying Glass podcast. I am your host, Carly. For today's episode, I will be interviewing and discussing Quebec nationalism, multiculturalism, interculturalism, and Quebec politics with Professor Felix Mathieu. He is a professor at the University of Winnipeg. He holds a PhD in political science from the University du Quebec in Montreal, and his research interests are Canadian politics, Quebec studies, comparative federalism, nationalism, multiculturalism, interculturalism, constitutional studies, and public opinions and Canada.
So, but just before we start, so you're starting a graduate program at Brock University, is that so?
No, at University Edinburgh.
Edinburgh, okay, because you emailed me from a Brock U email or something.
I just graduated there.
Okay, congratulations.
Yeah. In political science and sociology.
Yep.
Yeah. I took like 5 years off, so I just came back 4 years ago. Finished it mostly online because of COVID, but that's okay. And
now Edinburgh, starting in September.
Yes, online though, not there.
Okay, how so?
It's very expensive to live there and pay international fees. So I'm lucky. My parents can pay for the tuition. So
but make sure you do go there at some point, because it's an amazing city to be in, and like I think from a political science perspective, like they have the University of Edinburgh, like they have their Center on Constitutional Studies, which is a pretty big center there. And
really?
Yeah.
Oh, you've been there?
Yeah, I've been there. It's a lovely city. Well, it rains a lot, but it's a lovely city.
It looks really nice with the castle.
Yeah, absolutely.
I've always wanted to do a degree in Europe, but it's online. But hey, it doesn't matter. It's still kind of there, but not there.
Yeah. So what's the degree? Is this a second MA or it's a PhD?
Oh, and a first master's.
Yeah.
In international development.
Okay, great.
Yeah. It's hoping to focus on refugees and humanitarian aid.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I know there is a professor there in international relations. I should look.
Okay.
I look bad because I don't remember his name, but we were graduate students at the same time at Laval University maybe a decade ago.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And you did your PhD, I can't pronounce it.
UQAM, so University du Québec à Montréal.
Okay. And you went to Laval?
I did my undergrad and master's degree at Laval University,
It's a very good school.
Yeah, it's a lovely, like, it has, like, it's like an American university campus. It's literally a city. There's so many students there, and all the departments, there's the buildings, there's the pub, so like you really feel like you belong to the university. Whereas like at UQAM, where I did my PhD, you're in downtown Montreal, so which is pretty nice as well, but it's not the same like sense of belonging to a university community, because there are multiple universities in Montreal.
Oh, okay, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Did you study at McGill? Or I hope to go there if I can. It's a nice.
I never studied like as a student at McGill, but it's a gorgeous school. Like just by the Mont Royal, so the mountain in Montreal, and it's just it's an amazing place. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, it's a really good school. It's kind of hard to get in, but yeah. And you're from Montreal or Quebec then?
Yeah, well, Montreal.
Yeah.
I spent like 15 years in Quebec City, but I was born in Montreal, and now also, because right now I'm in Montreal, so I spend the summer in Montreal. I work at the University of Winnipeg, so in Manitoba, and I was in Spain for 3 months before
wow.
that. Yeah.
Oh, nice. For work or just vacation or?
Yeah, work, but I also took vacation there. I was visiting a professor at the Universitat Pompeu Fabra, which is a research-oriented university in Barcelona.
Oh, nice. Okay, cool, awesome. It sounds like you have an exciting career.
Yeah,
yeah,
trying to.
Yeah. Do you ever want to like work in Quebec as a professor, or is it really hard to work where you want to work, or like?
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
I mean, the market in like academia is like it's hard to get in, and whenever you get in, you don't necessarily pick where you'll land. I wanted to stay in Canada for a variety of reasons because one of my main field of expertise is Quebec and Canadian politics, so I didn't necessarily want it to go abroad. But as long as I was able to teach Canadian politics, and I mean, that was fine by me.
Okay. Yeah, I hear with some prof, like some of them don't want to go to certain ones, but you kind of don't have a choice, right?
Exactly. When I was doing my postdoc and I just submitted applications after applications, and at some point you do hear back from some and you get interviewed, and I mean I got the offer and I said yes, so that's what happened.
Yeah. Oh, that's good. Yeah, I'm hoping to do a PhD too. It's just the master's would be good for a while because you can work for a bit and then go back if you want. So yeah.
Good. And how have you come with the idea of doing this podcast?
I honestly, I wanted to start it like during the pandemic, but I'm just overwhelmed with that. And I've always wanted to like interview academics and like politicians. I'm really nerdy that way, and I like interviewing people. I love learning about people. It's just a professor said if you really like it, a podcast might be a good way to learn more about academia and topics and meet people. So
absolutely.
It is a lot of work though, but I have someone that edits it and stuff, but it's like you got to come up with good questions, find the right people.
Yeah. So how did you find me? Someone suggested you contact me, or?
I looked up like Quebec Nationalism in Canada,
and my name popped up.
Your name popped up in Google. So yeah.
Excellent.
It was like right up there. So yeah.
Good to know.
And it seemed like you know so much about it. And I really wanted to interview someone on that. So I was going to interview someone at University of Ottawa, but they're too busy right now. So yeah.
Was it André Lecourt?
He's in the political. He's really famous for nationalism. I can't pronounce his name though.
Yeah, probably André Lecourt.
Yeah,
he has like this recent
guy.
book. Yeah. He has this recent book on like nationalism, autonomy, and something at Oxford University Press.
Yeah, he's like grayish. He's an older. Okay, because he knows a lot about it apparently, but he's just busy right now. So
yeah.
Well, I got the questions you sent me. Do you want to go over some of them?
I'm fine. Basically, so it's your podcast. I'm just here to follow you wherever you want us to go. This should last for about an hour, or
however you want. It depends on how long the questions are, and maybe 30 to 40 minutes or an hour.
Excellent. Good. Okay. So I'm just here to enjoy the ride with you.
All right. 1 second. Let me get them pulled up. And it's nice to talk a bit first because sometimes I get a little bit nervous, so it's good to like talk for a bit and then you can start it.
Yep.
It helps with your public speaking, so.
And me, I haven't spoken in English for about 3-4 weeks now, so I was like, at least we'll have a first conversation before we jump in the real stuff.
Okay, for the first question is, what is Quebec nationalism? How did it come to be, and how has it evolved through time? I believe that's the question you sent. So we could open it up with that on the floor if you like.
Yeah, so whenever someone talks about Quebec nationalism, I think the most important thing to do is to differentiate between what we refer to as Quebec nationalism today, differentiate it with what it was before. And when I say before, we can take as a starting point basically 150 years ago, the very beginning of modern federal Canada. At this point, we were talking about not Quebec nationalism, but a Canadien-Français nationalism, so a French-Canadian form of nationalism, which was mostly oriented towards Catholicism, the Catholic religion, and the national identity were connected fundamentally. One could not exist without the other. And it was all about the idea of surviving as a distinct cultural religious group. So even Georges-Étienne Cartier, one of our founding fathers at the time of the Quebec Conference, 1864, so what led to the British North America Act, 1867, he used to talk about the French Canadian as a race. He considered it as a race, as an ethnic group, just as Lord Durham would have said a few decades before that. And the idea was that for this group to survive and to preserve what made it a distinct society, which is a term that comes much later on in the second half of the 20th century. But at this point, the idea for French Canadian nationalism is all about making sure that a certain religious purity is maintained, because they looked at Protestantism and the overall economic and religious dynamics in the US and in English Canada, for instance, to be something dangerous. They needed to fight against that, to fight against modernity. And so up until the second half of the 20th century, that's the main storyline. So Quebec nationalism is about to survive. It's intrinsically connected to Catholicism as a religion that everyone share. And it comes with the idea that people from a Catholic background tend to speak French. But French is not yet the core identity marker. It arrives later on, it's precisely in the second half of the 20th century, and I would say with what we call the Quiet Revolution in Quebec. So basically starting the 1960s. At that point, basically speaking French kind of replaces the idea that everyone part of this community had to be Catholic. So French becomes this new core identity marker, which is more inclusive in the way it appears as well. So people from different religious background could feel entitled of saying they are part of this specific project. And it coincides as well with this moment when French Canada starts to exist on its own, so Francophone communities outside of Quebec, and Quebec as a group that is territorially concentrated towards around the verges of the St. Lawrence River, and that speaking French is what connects people on that specific territory. It also connects with the idea of having a provincial government that starts saying, look, we are evolving in a federal system. The Constitution grants a lot of powers to the provinces, but up until yet, provinces didn't make use much of these powers because religious communities were in charge of the healthcare system. Religious communities were in charge of the educational system. But in the 1960s and onwards, Quebec, but also the other provinces at various degrees, started to occupy these constitutional fields. They started to develop their own curriculums, to have their own narrative, to understand who they are, how they came to be, and how they relate to the Canadian democratic project as a whole. And so in this second half of the 20th century, Quebec nationalism is gradually transforming into something that is territorially and civic oriented, whereas before that it was more about religion. And so there was an ethno-cultural dimension that was core to it. And in the second half of the 20th century, the idea is to make this movement more inclusive and territorially oriented. And a lot of this has to do with the way that France organized its own understanding of what is the French nation because of the linguistic aspect. Many Quebec intellectuals had their eyes turned towards France. They were reading French philosophers, French sociologists, and when they were talking about La Nation Française, so the French nation, the idea was that everybody on the French territory is part of that nation. So there was a similar sense of what is it to belong to the Quebec nation, and it's also a way to embark both feet right at the same time within political modernity, whereas for the first half of the 20th century, political and religious elites were fighting modernity in Quebec.
Yeah, I was curious. So I don't know if you mentioned it earlier, but do you know why a lot of people wanted to leave France and go to Canada or Quebec specifically, or is there is there religious reasons or cultural reasons, or?
Yeah, so the French colony, so La Nouvelle-France, existed basically at the same time that the British Empire was colonizing North America, and that the Portuguese were doing the same thing in America as well. And what happened is that at some point in the 18th century, there was a battle between the empires in North America. So that led to the Battle of the 7 Years in between 1756 and 1763. I would say at that point. And one key event at that point was what is remembered mostly in Quebec curriculums as the British conquest, which is not something that is remembered the same way in English-speaking curriculums in Canada. But that's the moment when basically France decided to leave its colony to the British Empire. And at that point, what that meant is that first, the British Empire tried to assimilate French-speaking population, refused the idea that Catholicism was allowed to be practiced, refused that French-speaking could speak French together, and also that they could settle disputes using French-inspired civil code. And the assimilation failed because the numbers didn't add up. So the French-speaking population was much more larger than the English-speaking population at that point in what was called the province of Quebec. And 249 years ago, right now, what happened is the Act of Quebec, the Quebec Act of 1774, and this basically restored some institutional levers on which the French-speaking Catholic group could maintain itself. So the Catholic Church was rehabilitated. The French-speaking population could now again settle the dispute using the civil code, which is something that still exists today, which is part of Canadian bijuridism, to have common law for most people outside of Quebec, and the French-inspired civil code for French-speaking people in Quebec. And also the way that the territory is organized, the territorial organization, so inspired from the French regime versus the cantonal way to organize the territory, the way to organize agriculture as well. So both were maintained in a parallel way. And this explains why there is a significant French-speaking population still today in Canada. And actually, French are the French-speaking communities form the majority of the people in what would become Canada up until basically 1840s, 1845s. That's why as well when the Union, the Union, the Union Act in 1841 was implemented, creating the United Canada, the colonial authorities refused to have a representative assembly in a way that they would have granted elsewhere in other parts of the Commonwealth, because it would have been dominated by French-speaking representatives, and they didn't wanted this to happen. So that's why we have to wait a few years until 1848 for this really to materialize, with responsible government to emerge, and then later on with federal Canada to emerge in 1867, where Quebec would be the home of the French-speaking population that would form a majority there. But of course, there are French-speaking communities that exist outside of Quebec, in Ontario, in what would become Manitoba, later on in what would become Saskatchewan, Alberta, and so on and so forth. And there's also all the Métis communities. For instance, the Red River Métis community in Winnipeg, that emerged out of intermarriage between descendants of French-speaking colonies that were there in the 17th century, that settled, that married at some point, and they settled their camp there, what would become with Louis-Riel, the Red River community.
Okay, I did not know that, but that's very interesting. Is Quebec like one of the first places to like be colonized, or like I hear it's one of the first, or Newfoundland, or I'm not sure, but like Quebec is one of the oldest.
Yeah, well, you have some of the oldest cities that were fortified. For instance, Quebec City was created in 1608, so it's more than 400 years old, which is arguably one of the oldest cities in North America. And when you visit Quebec City, you can still see the walls and what was preserved from that period. So yeah, of course, then you can talk about the indigenous peoples that were there for far more longer periods of times. But yeah, Quebec is one of the first colonies, with the 13 colonies south of today's borders that also emerged roughly at the same period of time.
Yeah, I was also curious. Do you know about like the architecture and the buildings in like Montreal and Quebec? Like, is it very heavily influenced from like Europe, you would say, or France? Like, it seems like you're walking into a European city when you're there.
Yeah, I think you get this feeling mostly when you visit downtown Old Quebec.
Yeah.
So within the walls, for various reasons. First, these were indeed constructed. A variety of buildings were constructed in the 17th, 18th century. So yeah, they're pretty old, and the Quebec government also invested a lot of money to protect these heritage buildings. So that's also why they're still there, and they have been rehabilitated and they have been repaired according to the traditional ways of doing things with these kinds of building. I think it's more striking in Quebec City than in Montreal. Montreal is much more modern in how it's organized. There's the old Montreal, the old port, which has some buildings. There's the Basilique Notre Dame, so the Cathedral of Montreal. Around this square, like there's a lot of old gorgeous buildings that you can feel a sense of Europeanness, but I think it's more striking in Quebec City.
Okay, I did not know that. I haven't been to Quebec City, so that's interesting to know. Why are Quebec nationalists against Canadian multiculturalism? What is multiculturalism? The Canadian policy of multiculturalism? Is Canadian multiculturalism a good fit to deal with a minority nation such as Quebec? I don't know if you want.
Oh. Yeah, no way. I can say a word about all this. So Canadian multiculturalism emerged in October 1971 when Prime Minister Pierre-Elliott Trudeau stood up in the House of Commons and announced that there would be from now on a Canadian policy on multiculturalism. And he did so, as he did in a few other occasions, without telling many people around him, even people within his own cabinet. They were caught by surprise. They didn't know he was about to present a policy of multiculturalism. And all this happens in the midst of the Commission on Bilingualism, the Royal Commission on Bilingualism and Biculturalism, which is a commission that was chaired by Davidson Dunton and André Laurendeau. Throughout the 1960s, they held a variety of meetings to hear about people in Canada, what is Canada, what is biculturalism, what is bilingualism, and they made two main recommendations, one being that Canada should adopt an official policy of bilingualism to have two official languages, and the other recommendation was that we should invest the idea that Canada was founded on two people, on two equal partners, and what they called biculturalism. Around the 1966, 67, there were meetings that were held in the Canadian prairies, and there is this group that self-called, they call themselves the Third Force. A lot of people from Ukraine, by the way, that settled them there, that became Canadian, that were saying, look, we like your idea of having a Canada with two official languages. We don't mind having to learn either English or French. But when you talk about biculturalism, how do we fit here? Because we're neither from French or English descent. So instead of biculturalism, we would prefer something like multiculturalism. And at that point, it wasn't like a concept that people were using on a daily basis. So it was kind of a new discursive approach. And Pierre-Elliott Trudeau clearly found interest there in this concept. And I think there's both like pure moral motivation. I think he agreed with the basic idea that Canada should be understood as a mosaic of cultures. Fundamentally, he himself saw himself as a citizen of the world, and so he had this more cosmopolitan philosophical approach. But politically speaking, Pierre-Elliott Trudeau, when he became the Prime Minister of Canada, the late 1960s, his main political opponents were in Quebec. It was the rising Parti Québécois that took power for the first time in 1976. So he saw this as a real potential threat to Canada, to the idea that Canada could implode because Quebec would secede. And multiculturalism appeared to him as a way to challenge the idea that many Quebecers had, that Canada was made of two founding peoples, and therefore Quebec could simply secede and have its own political state, political organization, independent from that of Canada. And so Pierre-Elliott Trudeau said, look, in Canada, there will be two official languages. That's the Official Languages Act, adopted in 1969. 2 years later, 1968, 3 years later, 1971, he adopts multiculturalism as a policy, not as a law yet. It will become a law in 1988, so 15 years later or so. And in 1971, what he did is said, there will be no communities deemed more or less Canadians than the others. There's no two founding Canadian people or nation. There's a variety of cultural communities, among which Quebec is one. It's not special. It's not different from the others. It should not benefit from a differentiated treatment. So basically, he says we need to welcome diversity, and all diversity components are to be treated the same way in Canada. Indigenous peoples were not so happy with this approach as well, because they didn't want it to be perceived as minorities among all the other communities. They saw themselves as independent nations that were colonized. In Quebec, a similar narrative played out. So people in Quebec, and the first one of them, the Premier of Quebec at that point, Robert Bourassa, he instantly rejected the philosophy of Canadian multiculturalism because it said it doesn't recognize the specificity of Quebec as being not a cultural group or a cultural community that arrived by more or less recent immigration. It is a national or a societal community. It exists via its own set of institutions. It wants to exist as a whole society of itself. And therefore, if Canadian multiculturalism is about how to forge a pluralist Canadian community from coast to coast to coast, there's no room in this narrative for Quebec to exist as its own host society parallel to that of English Canada as a whole. And so he sent a letter to Pierre-Elliott Trudeau a few weeks after the Canadian multiculturalism policy was presented in Ottawa, and this started a battle, kind of a tug of war between Quebec authorities and Ottawa authorities in terms of how should we be dealing with immigration, because Quebec, the first province in Canada to ever do so, developed its own ministry, Department of Immigration, in 1968. And at that point, precisely, the idea was that we need to receive immigrants from French-speaking communities in the world. So this will facilitate their integration within Quebec host society. But at the same time, if you have one Canadian multiculturalism policy, it conflicts. And so throughout the 1970s, there were a variety of intergovernmental agreements that were reached between Quebec and Canadian authorities. 1971, there was one, 1975, 1978, and we need to wait until eventually 1991 to have the one agreement that holds still today, which is the Canada-Quebec Agreement on Immigration, or the McDougall-Gagnon-Tremblay Agreement, with the names of the ministers that were in charge, that basically makes it that Quebec now, since then, has the capacity to select its own immigrants, so it can decide to have its own set of criteria. For instance, linguistic capacity in French, in addition to the Canadian criteria. But that's only for a specific part of the immigration. Since the 1970s, therefore, Quebec kind of developed its own unofficial integrationist policy, which is called interculturalism in Quebec. So the interculturalist approach to immigration would stress that Quebec is a majority as a community on Quebec territory, but a minority within the Canadian federal system. And therefore, it stresses that there needs to be what some documents stressed in 1990 in Quebec, a moral contract between newcomers and the whole society in Quebec, that the whole society needs to make effort to make sure that newcomers integrate within the French-speaking public environment in Quebec, but at the same time that the newcomers had to accept the idea that the public space would be conducted in French, that it's a different whole societal community than in the rest of Canada as a concept. So it led to the development, and I say unofficial because still today in Quebec there's no official policy of interculturalism. Quebec officials referred to this idea plenty of times in their public policies, but we're still waiting to have one public policy that would echo Canadian multiculturalism on that point.
Okay, that's very interesting to know. I did not know that. I just wanted to ask, do you think there's anything problematic with like multiculturalism? Like, is there anything negative or difficult about it you find? Or I think Canada's one of the most unique countries because we're one of the most multicultural, like especially in terms of that policy you said from Pierre Trudeau. Like not many countries have come forward with that kind of policy paper.
Yeah, absolutely. And when we ask Canadians what are the key characteristics that make Canada stand out. They would say like multiculturalism is one of the key positive aspect about Canada. And still, and even in Quebec, multiculturalism in for many reasons is also a concept that is quite popular. It's on the political agenda that it is problematic because of the way it was presented and how Quebec reacted to this. But then also we need to remember that Canadian multiculturalism was included, Section 27, in the Constitution Act 1982. So when we patriated the Canadian Constitution from London, we included a clause about an interpretative clause about Canadian multiculturalism, about the Canadian multicultural heritage that relies on the 1971 policy. And in 1982, Quebec refused to sign the final deal for, again, a variety of other historical reasons, and felt betrayed by his partners in the other provinces and in Ottawa, because Quebec was excluded from the last bargaining operation that led to the 1982 Constitution Act. And so this political moment, how it came to be, people that lived this moment had experienced a moment that they associated negatively with the idea of multiculturalism. So I think this needs to be to be stressed. But also when we compare interculturalism and multiculturalism, in the end, these two are pretty similar in many ways. These are both pluralist models of how to deal with diversity and immigration. They both reject assimilation. They both want to favor some policy of recognition, to recognize that newcomers have their own ethnocultural background, that these are important for their own sense of belonging, and that these are welcome to be expressed in the public sphere, in the public space. And in the end, they also both wish that these policies lead to some form of integration, that newcomers feel they belong to their host society. The main difference is that Canada did not, when it comes to Canadian multiculturalism, did not politicize the idea of integration, because newcomers that are arriving in English Canada, they will want to learn English for a variety of concrete reasons. They want to find a job, for media reasons. If you want to embrace culture, most of it will be in English. So there are plenty of reasons for people to learn English, and it's the most dominant language in the world today. However, French is not, and therefore it's harder to convince people, newcomers, to learn French. If you want to preserve that distinctiveness, that cultural distinctive specificity in North America, there's a need to make sure that newcomers not only integrate and feel they belong to Canada as a whole, but also they feel part of the Quebec project to be that it is organized in French. And so the main difference is about where do you integrate, and do you need to politicize this issue, or if it's something that goes pretty much naturally for newcomers.
Okay, that's very interesting. I didn't think of it that way. I think Toronto is really unique because it is one of the most multicultural cities. Like, there's like ethnic neighborhoods, so many type of cultural festivals. Like it just goes to show, like, we do really encourage different cultures and different backgrounds, and it's like one of the best cities to bring in refugees and immigrants as well.
Yeah, well, Toronto in itself, is bigger in terms of population than many Canadian provinces. So if you look at this from that angle only, of course, it's a world in itself. Like, it's not the same thing to be in Toronto than to be in St. John's in Newfoundland. Like, you cannot, it's not the same reality at all.
Yeah. No, I just find it a really unique city for that aspect, and Ottawa and Vancouver and Montreal as well.
Yeah.
I think you said you don't know much about municipal political parties. I don't know if you know much about Project Montreal or Valerie Plante or.
So I'm not an expert in municipal politics, but of course, as someone who lived in Montreal for multiple years, I know about it as a citizen, and I can apply analytical framework to this. What's interesting here is that it's a political party that is taking root, something that we've seen emerging in Vancouver, for instance, but most Canadian cities, they don't operate, politically speaking, under the banner of political parties. It's most of the time under the banner of a single name. So the team of X person, and when they retire, it's over. So Projet Montréal with Valérie Plante, second term now. It's hard to see, it's hard to know at this point if it will survive indeed Valérie Plante. Because one of the core definition of what is a political party is that it needs to survive its founding leader. If there is no succession, then it was mostly surrounding the charismatic figure of one leader. And still today, although Projet Montréal has its own political identity, it's unsure who could step in and maintain this identity alive. For instance, imagine that in the next election, Projet Montréal fails to win a third mandate in a row, and therefore Valérie Plante resigns, and then there's a leadership race. And for that person to maintain this political organization active for 4 years while being in the opposition, that's still to see. So we'll see if that happens. But what also benefits Projet Montréal is that many of their supporters and many of their volunteers are also volunteers and supporters of Quebec Solidaire, so the most left-wing provincial party in Quebec, similar to the NDP in many ways, but it's an independentist party. So it's the NDP on the socio-democratic level of values, but they still want to have an independent Quebec. So that's the main point of division, of course, between them. But they share Projet Montréal and Quebec Solidaire, the same pool of volunteers in Montreal. And so that helps them a lot right now. But then it's hard to know whether this movement will indeed consolidate in the future, and there will be many ways of supporters.
That's very true. I just find the Montreal, like, I mean, municipal election, like, they're one of the only cities that can that have municipal political parties, and Vancouver as well. So I just didn't know if that was a way to, like, kind of encourage their nationalism or their culture in a way, like having these parties. Because Project Montreal really does try to push for Francophone heritage and stuff, with buildings and the language. Like, they want to preserve more of the French language. I know they're really big on environmental and greenery as well too. That's probably their biggest thing. Like, they're one of the best for, like, parks and, like, greenery, which is fascinating.
Yeah. So that exactly, they're very close. Like on their main propositions, they're very close in the spirit of these propositions with what Quebec Solidaire offers at a provincial level. But the difference between what we're seeing here in Canada and many similar federal systems, be that Germany, for instance, or Belgium, the political parties that emerge at the municipal level, they tend to emerge as new independent political force. They will not call themselves the Liberal Party of Montreal. So there's a disconnect here that is quite abnormal. In many federal systems, you will see the same political parties operating at all levels of organization, the municipal, at the provincial, and at the federal levels here. It helps to make sure that you can have one organization that is pretty much organized, and you can send people to make their marks at the municipal level, and if they do well, they can go at the provincial level, and at some point even at the federal level. Here, there's no such dynamics. So parties operate very independently from one another. There's only the NDP that operates at the federal and provincial levels, except in Quebec, in in the same organization. Even the liberal parties that exist in Ontario, in Quebec, in British Columbia, they have nothing to do anymore with the Liberal Party at the federal level, and even the Liberal Party in BC, it's much more. It's a conservative party compared to the Liberal Party in Ontario or Quebec.
Yeah, that's very true. I think Quebec is really unique because it has its own provincial like political parties, and it gives it more autonomy and like kind of try to preserve their culture and political views in a way. Yeah, I know someone that studies all about Quebec provincial parties and stuff. So yeah, not many people like the current premier, but that's okay.
Yeah. That's a fact. Well, in Quebec, he's still pretty popular. Huh? People, they might tend to forget about this, but the last provincial election, like he won a landslide victories, controlling basically 90 something seats out of 125, and even these bills that are quite unpopular. When you ask people in Canada, Bill 21 on secularism, Bill 96 on the updating of the Bill 101 Charter of French Language, these are still receiving a solid majority of support from people in Quebec. So there's a lot of people that disagree with François Legault's Coalition Avenir Québec. These tend to be very vocal. They tend to have their place in the media. And so we hear these critical viewpoints. But in the polls, François Legault is still doing pretty good. He's pretty stable. And I think his charismatic figure, in a sense, really showed up during the COVID pandemic. I think this helped him a lot in that way. He was able to maintain his the figure of him being a good father to the Quebec population and governing in for the well-being of everyone. But specifically in Montreal, because he has very few elected members of the Quebec National Assembly that have been elected in Montreal. So in Montreal, people are much more critic about him, but elsewhere in Quebec, he's pretty popular still.
He is, yes. I like learning about provincial Quebec politics, so it's kind of neat to touch on that. For the unofficial Quebec policy of interculturalism, how different is it from Canadian multiculturalism? How did it come to be? Why is interculturalism important for Canada? If you want to touch on that.
Yeah, so I did say a few words about this in some of my previous answer, but basically, because the Canadian policy of multiculturalism evolved like quite importantly since 1971, and today, when you look at the core policy of the objectives of the policy, it is now much more similar to Quebec's interculturalism, the way it has been designed than it was before, because today Canadian multiculturalism stresses much more than it did before the duty for newcomers to integrate within the Canadian public sphere, to integrate to the Canadian political project in a way that Quebec always did when it talked about its own political project. So today there's fewer differences than they were before, but the main difference is that Quebec interculturalism is to favor the perenity of Quebec as a distinct society, whereas for Canadian multiculturalism, the idea is to foster a sense of belonging for all people residing in Canada.
Very true. I think you slightly touched on Bill 21. I don't know if you want to delve more into that, or what are your thoughts on it? Is it a good thing? Is it a negative thing? What are the consequences of that being passed through the Supreme Court? I think that was one of your questions on it.
Yeah, so the Supreme Court has not pronounced itself yet on this, so it's still the court still needs to give their ruling on this. It's not yet at the level of the Supreme Court. It will get there at some point, But so Bill 21, to make a long story short, is the final piece of legislation in a series of other attempts to legislate on that specific issue on secularism. So in 2006, 2008, there was this crisis of reasonable accommodation, and this led to Quebec holding a public how do you say this in English? A public commission on reasonable accommodation. It was chaired by Charles Taylor, so renowned political philosopher, and Gérard Bouchard, renowned sociologist and historian. And they held a series of meetings. They asked people about how they felt with regards to reasonable accommodation practices and what they one of their conclusions is that clearly there is an identity malaise in Quebec with people having a feeling of collective fragility or insecurity, and there was a perception that granting that being too accommodative towards newcomers, it would fragilize the Quebec society or the Quebec cultural majority in a way that needed not to happen. And so the commissioners, what they said is that we need to adopt first a policy on interculturalism, similar to Canadian multiculturalism. It will provide a narrative for people in Quebec to not only understand who they are, but also their relationships with the newcomers. And so the perceptions, which were mostly about misperceptions, because most people that went in front of the commissioners and told them about some situation they felt were unreasonable had very little to do with concrete practices of reasonable accommodation. So it's a lot about perceptions, less about reality, but perceptions and symbols matters, and they matter in politics. And so they said we need to adopt an interculturalism policy. This has yet to be done, but that was the first step. Their second step was they say Quebec officials needs to adopt a white paper on secularism, on laïcité, and eventually legislate on that. And the commissioners were in favor of what they called an open secularism understanding. So Charles Taylor with Jocelyn McClure, also from McGill University, they've advanced this idea in the public sphere, how secularism is mostly about how to make sure everyone from every religious background is not discriminated against by public officials. The Parti Québécois took power in 2012 for a brief period of time, 18 months, and they've advanced their charter of values. So I think it was Bill 60 at that point. And in this charter of values, they decided not to go with the open secularism view, but rather with a more French-inspired secularism. So as it is in France, which basically is a way to say the state needs to be completely neutral in the face of the expression of religious expression, but in the way it makes it that those from the dominant majority are simply not affected by these new rulings, because religious expression of Catholicism is something that fits pretty well with the private public divides, that people can practice their religion on their private own time. They need not necessarily to showcase a huge cross or something that would have been deemed unacceptable to work in the public administration, for instance, or to have an alliance. I mean, it's a religious symbols, but it's today secularized in terms of symbols. And therefore, this approach has a huge impact on specific religious communities. Muslim women in particular wearing the headscarf, for instance. That is not something that, if you believe wearing the headscarf is core to your understanding of living a good life, it's not something that you can wear in your private time, but in the public sphere simply take off. And therefore it put a threshold on specific communities that is unmatched with regards to what it had to do with the majority of people in Quebec. So I think that's the main point of contention that emerged, and that still today is in place, because Bill 21 sorry, Bill 21 is pretty close to the Parti Québécois Charter of Values. It echoes many of the aspects they had planned.
Okay, I didn't know that.
And also, there's one. So in Quebec, with the Bouchard-Taylor Commission I was talking about before, there was kind of a consensus that emerged out of this that it would be fine to make it that a specific category of public officials of people working for the public administration, it would be okay to restrict for them specifically the possibility of wearing conspicuous religious symbols, but not for all. And they had in mind basically prison guards, police officers, judges, those that have a coercive authority on you, on an individual. And because of that coercive power, they say from a sociological and political perspective, we need to hold them to a higher degree of religious neutrality. They need not to express their religious preference to make sure that the judgment they will pose on someone that will affect their life specifically, that the other person cannot presume that they have been judged according to what their own their respective religious backgrounds was. That was something more of a consensus in the public debate. But then what the CAQ and before that the Parti Québécois did is that they included to that list of people that should not be allowed to wear religious symbols. They added the category of teachers and principals in high schools and primary schools, for instance. The problem with that, and I believe this is one of the key elements that might be stricken down by the courts, by the Supreme Court of Canada at some point, is that there is no empirical evidence that wearing a religious symbol is actually leading to proselytism, to wanting other people to embrace your own religious background. And there's no empirical evidence also that wearing your religious symbols as a teacher, for instance, would would not allow me to teach pedagogical material in a neutral way and for students to receive this pedagogical material in a neutral way. So as long as there's no empirical evidence on these two aspects, I think the Supreme Court of Canada will reject that part of the bill. This is probably one of the few articles that might probably be that will be retracted from the bill. That's how it goes. The court says no, you can't do that, and then the legislative power needs to adapt to this. So we'll probably see something about that. But for the most part, I believe that Bill 21 will stay as it is, specifically because if you look at the guiding principles, if you look at the preamble of the bill, it's about making sure that gender equality is maintained. It's about making sure that the state is separated from religious preferences. It's about generic values that are pretty much universal in the sense of Western liberal traditions. So nothing specific to the Quebec case. However, it's about the means that are included in the bill. How should we reach this, specifically saying that teachers and principals should not wear religious symbols? I think this is the aspect that is mostly problematic.
Oh, for sure. I just find it an interesting bill because, like, we are very multicultural, but then that one incident, it kind of just blows up. Like, I don't know, it could be worse, I guess, but I don't know, to some extent, like, I don't know, it's a very complicated topic, but in a way, like, I can understand why a lot of Quebec, nationalists or like people really like the Quebec culture want to hold on to that and not, have too much of a melting pot there, maybe.
Yeah. It's maybe something that is important to remind as well in our discussions that being nationalist in Quebec is pretty mainstream. It's something like if you look at the political parties represented at the Quebec National Assembly right now that are represented there, they are all nationalist in their own way. I mean, the the governing party right now is not an independentist party. It says it's an autonomist party. They want more power, not full independence, but more power within the federal system. Parti québécois, Québec solidaire, they want full independence. The Liberal Party of Quebec, they also are nationalist in their own way, because they believe that political actions should be made in the interest first and foremost of Quebec, not Canada. So Canada is more of a partnership with which Quebec is in a relationship, a political relationship with Canada, but Quebec is the community you are serving first and foremost.
Yeah.
That's pretty consensus. Although there are many people in Quebec that might not be that might not feel comfortable saying they're nationalist, specifically if they come from European background, for instance, because nationalism in Europe, because of the history of the 20th century, is something that still today is associated to Nazi, to the Nazi political ideology, but also to outright populist agenda in many European democracies right now. And therefore, I think there's an important distinction to be made between what it means to say you're a nationalist in Quebec and what it may mean in other contexts, for instance, in Europe.
That's good to differentiate that. Like maybe some people don't want to be identified as a nationalist, but they really may be patriotic, or they just really feel connected to Quebec or Montreal as a culture. But they don't want to be autonomous or separate from Canada.
Exactly.
Yeah, I wanted to touch on AB1 a little bit on why Lucien Bouchard, why an important politician for Quebec politics, in terms of the splinter party of Bloc Québécois with the Meech Lake Accord. I think that may have had something to do with it. I know he's a very important figure in Quebec. I don't know if you want to dabble into that a bit.
Yeah, so for just for you to know, and Gérard Bouchard was talking about him. He co-chaired the commission with Charles Taylor. Gérard Bouchard is actually the brother of Lucien Bouchard, so quite of an important family. So Lucien Bouchard has been premier of Quebec from 1995 to early 2001, I think, or 2002. After that, it was Bernard Landry who took the leadership of the Parti québécois. But before that, Lucien Bouchard, he was a federal MP. He was a federal MP that had been elected under the bannership of the Progressive Conservative Party when it was led by Brian Mulroney. And for instance, the Meech Lake Accord that was reached in 1987. They had 3 years to ratify it. It failed because both Manitoba and Newfoundland did not ratify the deal, so that's why it failed. Well, in 1987, there was this famous saying that we should go to this meeting with honor and enthusiasm, which is a phrase that stayed in people's socio-political imaginary, and that's a phrase written by Lucien Bouchard for the account of Brian Mulroney. So Brian Mulroney was very much relying on Lucien Bouchard to understand dynamics in Quebec, although Brian Mulroney knew Quebec pretty well for having lived there. But when the Meech Lake Accord failed, Lucien Bouchard felt that Canada betrayed his vision of what Canada should become, and that's when he decided to create its own political party. And so at some point he decided to walk the floor in the House of Commons and sit as an independent, and every day there was new people from mostly the Progressive Conservative Party, but also from the Liberal Party of Canada that decided to join his group, and eventually it became the Bloc Québécois, the Bloc, which still exists today, now led by Yves-François Blanchet. They still have about 35 MPs, I think, right now. So there's still a significant political force in the federal political landscape. But when this happened, the Bloc Québécois was not supposed to exist for a long time. It was supposed to exist only to prepare the moment when Quebec would secede and to make sure that negotiations would happen smoothly in Ottawa. And so
I didn't know that.
Their idea was that the party was to exist for 4, 5, 6 years until there was going to have a referendum, which happened in 1995. And in 1995, first of all, at the very beginning, it was supposed to be all around the figure of Jacques Parizeau, the premier of Quebec and the leader of the Parti québécois. But he wasn't as much popular as Lucien Bouchard was. And therefore, they asked Lucien Bouchard to campaign for the Yes camp during the referendum in 1995 with Jacques Parizeau. They also asked Dumont, so his first name, Mario Dumont, who was the leader of the Action démocratique du Québec, a provincial party that in a similar way emerged out of the Liberal Party of Quebec because they wanted more autonomy for Quebec, but not necessarily independence. Yet in the 1995 referendum, they joined the Yes campaign. And so Lucien Bouchard became the prominent figure in all these meetings and public gatherings for the Yes camp. And when on that evening on October 30, 1995, results were very close. I don't know if you know about this, but it's a margin. It's less than 54,000 votes that separated the Yes and the No camp. So it's less than 1%. So it's a very, very tight result, which led Jacques Parizeau that night to go on stage. He had a notes. He had a speech that had been written at that point by Jean-François Lisée, who would become years later the leader of the Parti québécois. He had notes to say something. He decided to go like as he felt, so with emotion. And in that speech on that night, he said two things. The first thing is that the referendum had been stolen by ethnic votes and by big money. So that was something he said, and clearly he regretted, because the Parti québécois had devoted time and energy for years to promote an inclusive nationalist project. And with these words, basically he went completely against that. But the most terrible part about that speech is what follows just after that. He says the 2/3 of us voted yes. And in this sentence, he means, and that's statistically correct, that the 2/3 of French-speaking voters voted yes. So in doing this, he stressed kind of a French-Canadian nationalist understanding, going back to 150 years before that, where French Canada was about an exclusive community. But the modern Quebec nationalist movement was supposed to be inclusive, territorial, civic. And so there's no logic in saying the 2/3 of us, meaning French-speaking people, voted in a way. And so this haunted the Parti québécois for the years to come, until today, I would say. And he then resigned, and then the Parti québécois called upon Lucien Bouchard to take the lead, and so he became the leader of the Parti québécois, became Prime Minister of Quebec, and he stayed there for a while. He also had a significant illness.
Okay.
I don't remember. I don't know the name in English, but basically he had to have one of his leg, and I think it's the left leg, cut just under the knee. And so he had, he already was a charismatic figure, but all this had added to his charisma and how he was resilient and like an important figure, basically. And so, yeah, he stayed in, and still after he left politics, he still remembered as someone that was proeminent during the 1995 referendum campaign. However, his legacy is not so bright altogether because he's also associated with the neoliberal shift in Quebec politics, which happened at pretty much at the same time in most Canadian provinces and in Canada, as we began to cut into all socio and public programs. So he was very keen on the idea that he wanted to have a deficit zero approach, and to do this, you had to cut down the public services.
Oh, okay. That's good to know. I had no idea about all that. You seem to know a lot about your history.
Yeah, well, that's my job.
Do you know much about René Lévesque? Is that how you say his name?
Yeah, René Lévesque, of course. So René Lévesque is the founder of the Parti Québécois. Before that, so René Lévesque, first of all, he's a journalist for Radio-Canada CBC. He's a journalist. He works for the Public Media Corporation, and he's very much appreciated by the public. The way he speaks, the way he smokes cigarettes all the time. At that point, people were smoking a lot of cigarettes while being on air, and he finally joined. He joined René. He joined Le Sage government. So in 1960, he was elected. Was in Le Sage cabinet. He held important positions, but he wanted eventually more than what the Liberal Party was offering. That is, he wanted an independent Quebec. And so he decided to resign from his position within the Liberal Party of Quebec. And there were a few movements, independentist movement at that point in the 1960s. The Mouvement Souveraineté Association, there was that he was part of, and there were other more intense or extremist groups at that point. And what he was able to do is that he was able to bring most people in favor of independence in Quebec under the banner of one political project, the Parti Québécois, which was founded in 1968. And so in 1968, he becomes the leader of this new party, but it will take, you need to wait until 1976 before this party, actually, the Parti Québécois, takes power. So it's kind of a long journey for him to not being actively not to be elected, but he was going through Quebec, campaigning all over Quebec every time. And so he really became a charismatic figure. I would say that the only other political figure that was as charismatic as his for the population of Quebec was that of Pierre Elliott Trudeau. And that's pretty much interesting because both political actors were there at the same time. They embodied diametrically different political views. One was a core federalist, one was a core independentist, and the people, the citizen of Quebec, voted en masse both for Trudeau on the federal level and for Lévesque at the provincial level. So we can see the tension between people, how they related to that. And so that's a very passionate moment for Quebec politics to have these two charismatic figures. René Lévesque, when he took power, basically they decided, because there were a variety of options, how do you achieve secession? There's no playbook for that. It's not something that here are the steps you need to follow to achieve this. Today, there's more clarification. People kind of know a bit more what worked, what didn't work. But at that point, it was much more try something, and if it fails, try something else. So people were discussing whether Quebec should simply declare unilaterally that now it is an independent country after having elected a sovereigntist party. But people decided that this wasn't a good idea. Rather, there should be a referendum. And so there would be multiple steps, the étapiste, so multiple steps approach. So first you get elected, then you show the people of Quebec that you are able to govern, to expand on the responsibilities the Quebec government can take. And then you organize a referendum. And then if you win, you negotiate a way out of Canada with federal authorities. So that was the game plan. And they wanted to maintain an economic partnership with Canada at the same time. And there were also issues related to army. Should Quebec have its own army? These are all, should people in Quebec still have, under an independent Quebec, have an independent dollar, or have the Canadian dollar? So these were issues that had to be negotiated after winning referendum. First referendum, 1980. The yes camp basically failed at a margin of 20%. So the no side wanted to maintain Canada united. They voted. They amounted to basically 60% of the referendum, and so it stayed that way. And René Lévesque today, there's no doubt that he is the political figure that all politicians say, I'm the heir to that. I'm embracing his political heritage. Both those that are within the Liberal Party of Quebec, they will say, nobody was with us before he turned independentist. He was a liberal. So we think we simply go a bit further back in the history and we connect with what he wanted to achieve. Those with the Parti Québécois say this is the party of René Lévesque, were the official heir of his, but also those people, those with the Québec Solidaire Party, the most leftist parties, say, actually, we are trying to embrace the authentic vision of René Lévesque. We're the true heir to him. So today he became somehow a consensual political figure that everybody kind of loves to remember.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I've heard of him. I know there's a statue of him. I learned about him a little bit in political science, but not too much. I think he died kind of young, or not too young, but.
Yeah, well, with the amount of cigarettes he was smoking, I think it was a no-brainer that this would happen sooner rather than later.
Yeah, it doesn't help your lungs.
No.
I thought it'd be kind of neat to touch on like Quebec culture in terms of like the food, or like is there, or sports, or Montreal Canadiens, or things like that, or like poutine, or like what makes it special for Quebec in terms of like their identity or culture. Yeah, I find that very interesting to hear about.
Yeah. Well, now I speak more as a citizen than as a professor. It's not my field of expertise, the way that the cultural connections, but I'm happy to talk about it. First, when we talk about the Montreal Canadiens, people sometimes forget that it's the Montreal Canadiens. It's with an E, not an A. And that's the name of the team, because before, people in French-speaking and Catholic part of Canada would call themselves French Canadians. Before that, they would call themselves simply Canadians. No English-speaking person living in what is known today as Canada called themselves Canadians before basically in between the two world wars, when they got the feeling of, they exist as a community, and only since the Westminster Treaty in 1931 does Canada have an international independent persona, and therefore before that it was part of the British Empire. John A. Macdonald used to say, I was born a British subject and I will die a British subject, and you know what? He's our founding father. And so it's kind of amazing to look at this, that he would never qualified himself as being Canadian. So that's, the Montreal Canadiens, the hockey team, although it's not as it's not as great as it used to be before, but still it is a symbol of proudness. People are proud of the Montreal Canadiens, and every season when there's not enough quote unquote French speakers that are recruited, people are mad. They say, why is the Montreal Canadiens not hiring more people from here to represent our culture, etc., etc. So it's an important symbol in terms of food, in terms of beers, in terms of all this, I think Quebec is pretty. It's pretty interesting here because there are very few Quebec dish. Of course, you can think of the poutine. Everywhere you'll go, you'll like restaurants. They always have a poutine. And today you have 1,000 varieties of poutine with all sorts of stuff you can put on it. But yeah, it's a traditional meal here. But apart from that, there's a lot that comes from France. There's a lot of that comes from every cultural background. So I think it's pretty similar. If you eat in Montreal, it's pretty similar to what you'll eat in Toronto, in Vancouver, in these huge urban settings where multiculturalism in terms of food is everywhere. And so it's the blend is with a specific tradition, a cooking culinary tradition that will come out. But it's pretty interesting to look at this from that angle. And even in terms of microbreweries, today you can find microbreweries pretty much everywhere in Canada. Quebec, you like to say they're proud of having some of the first microbreweries in the country. And it's amazing to know that I think it's a decade ago, Quebec won at on the international stage with a specific beer, the best triple Belgium inspired beer over the Belgians themselves. And therefore, like you can see that taking inspiration from other culinary traditions, you can make your own, and it can be part of your own understanding of what is being Quebecois or Quebecois cuisine on that point.
Oh, for sure. I just find that the food very unique there. Like they have their own kind of like national food in a way. I think there's like a lentil soup or some kind of soup.
Yeah. So there's that's fair enough. That's one like la soupe aux pois, so the pea soup is it's pretty famous, and even it became an insult in Quebec. Like English speakers tend to call French speaking people pissou because of the pea soup, and it stayed as something you would say to someone, but not in a gentle way. But today, not a lot of people use that expression anymore. But yeah, it has this long history. But there's also variety of meals that were created while constructing the railroads, for instance, the pâté chinois, so the Chinese pâté. I don't know how to say this in English, but simply saying it's beef with corn and then mashed potatoes that you put on together, and it's still called today pâté chinois, although it has nothing Chinese in it. It only has this name because this is one of the meal that was very popular at the time that people were constructing the railroads, and there was a lot of people from China working, or Asian heritage that was working on that, and so that became like a key meal for Quebec cuisine. Same with the tourtière. So if you go in the Lac Saint-Jean, in Saguenay, for instance, one of the regions of Quebec, they have their specific traditional meal that you would cook for Christmas, for instance.
Yeah, I didn't know that. Nice. I just found out I have French ancestry from like Moselle. I don't know if you've heard of that.
Yeah, Moselle, yeah.
I have my great grandfather's side. Apparently, they have a lot of French names. My uncle delved into our root history, so he's like, "Yeah, we're part French." So we have to go to Montreal more in Quebec.
Excellent. Well, we'll be waiting for you.
Sorry?
We will be waiting for you then.
Yes. You know what? I've always been interested in like France and Quebec as a culture, so I'm very glad to know I am part French. So.
Yes, that's a good starting point to start a conversation.
Oh yeah. I'm hoping to do like a PhD thing on Quebec nationalism and culture eventually. It's something I want to do. So.
Well, University of Ottawa would be a great fit with that because you can also be in both linguistic spheres at the same time.
Yeah, McGill would be good for that.
McGill would be amazing as well, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think I covered everything. If there's anything more, we chatted for over an hour, so.
Yeah, no, I'm pretty happy with what we've done here.
Oh no, it's perfect. We learned so much. I'm sure a lot of people would love to hear more about this.
Good. Well, thank you for inviting me.
Well, thank you for taking the time to do all this. I appreciate it.
I'm very happy I've done so, and it was a lovely conversation.
Well, have a good day then.
You as well.
All right. Take
Bye-bye.
care.